Awesome. It looks like we are live. I hope everybody can hear me. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome to Guy Aitchison's Reinventing the Tattoo Community, where tattooers, apprentices, collectors, and the curious are encouraged to join in these live events, real-world events, share and inspire to ultimately create better art and tattoos together every day, which is what we are doing right now. We're together with Dr. Maline Werness-Rude to talk about ancient American art. So we beam out nearly every day, and with your help, we've evolved into a network of on-demand reruns, shows, and all sorts of stuff happening right in our community. At community.reinventingthetattoo.com, you can find all of these things like real-world events. We've got a library of dozens and hundreds of hours of video content and new stuff added every day. You may be beaming out from YouTube or Facebook or watching us in the app, but either way, we always have something cool for you going on there. So we would be showing you some of these sponsored videos, but I'm going to actually just tell you guys about them today. We have Raw Pigments. Thank you for sponsoring us. They have acrylic-free pigments, and we'll be traveling to conventions once a month coming up. If you check out their website at rawpigments.co, you can find out more about them, as well as inkjet stencils. Everybody is familiar with their stuff. They have a lot to offer and a lot of time to save for you. If you haven't, inkjetstencils.com, they have a cool starter kit there available as well. D-Lize Pro, also known internationally as Dermalize Pro at dermalizepro.com, is amazing aftercare, top of the line products. And because of them, we're able to bring you all of this type of content for free. Otherwise, if you'd like to get the latest event schedule for all these shows that I'm talking to you guys about, you can get that at in your app store, either Apple or Google Play, or at reinventingthetattoo.com. So also every single day, we have cool stuff going on. So every Sunday, 1 p.m. Eastern, you're going to find Jason Lesser. He's got a reinventing drawing group where all skill levels are welcome. You can zoom in or you can watch, from your couch or wherever, but a lot to learn. If you'd like something critiqued, that'd be the perfect time to bring it. As well as Monday mornings at 9 a.m., we have Jake Meets from the Fireside Tattoo Network. And he does a weekly show that a lot of people kind of just draw together. It's open for everybody. They talk and the conversations are fantastic. Beyond that, every Thursday, the Tattoo Collecting Podcast is live from Red Tree Gallery with Fawn Baker and Jordan Ruckus. Always have different people that they bring on the show. They've got really cool commentary and stuff. It's worth a listen every Thursday at noon. So beyond that, today is an excellent show. We are going to be talking a lot about ancient American art, and we'll be watching a presentation. If you do have questions, and I know there will be questions, please go to our YouTube channel, and that's at reinventingthetattoo.com, or Facebook, or in the community app. Drop your question and we'll answer those towards the end, time permitted. Beyond that, I think we're going to hand it over and get this awesome conversation going. So if you'd like any questions, again, drop them and I will be asking those towards the end. Okay. All right. Hello, hello. I'm so happy to have you here today.
Hi.
So excellent. Before we do jump in, I noticed that you studied in Texas. We have some viewers from Texas who are rooting for you in that regard. So can you tell us a little bit about you and how you got involved in your studies and how you ended up as a professor in California?
Yeah, sure. Both of my parents are professors, so I already had kind of a model that I was looking at as I was growing up. And when I went to University of California at Davis, where I did my undergraduate, I actually thought that I was going to go on in math. And so I double majored in English and math. But then I got to the upper division in math and decided that I didn't want to do that after all. And so I changed and I double majored in English and art history with a minor in math. When I had to decide then, with an English and an art history degree, often the choice is graduate school at that point. And so then I had to decide which I wanted to follow. And so I applied to different graduate programs for different things. Folklore, for example, over at Indiana, Aztec at Columbia, Maya at UT. And basically I then kind of narrowed it down both by where I got accepted and where my interests, my real kind of core interests lay, and ultimately chose to study at University of Texas at Austin. I thought briefly about Tulane as well, where I'd also gotten accepted and where my parents both went too for their MAs. But finally kind of settled on UT, in part because I knew that I could get my master's and my PhD there in one go, so to speak. And once I got there, I was really happy with my decision because UT is an amazing place. Austin is an amazing place. And the community that I met there was just wonderful. Now, in terms of how I got started on Mesoamerica and the Maya specifically, I'm afraid it's not really that interesting of a story. I had, in my undergraduate, been really focused on pre-Raphaelite stuff, so early modern British stuff. And I decided by the end of that experience that while I still really love pre-Raphaelite stuff, I didn't want to write on it. I didn't want to focus my study on it, in part because all of the stuff that I like, which is to focus on symbolism and the way in which symbolism conveys meaning and really kind of decoding images at that level, had already all been done for the pre-Raphaelites. And so I started thinking, well, what other kinds of things did I really like? And of course, I liked folklore and native narratives. And I also really enjoyed the one survey course of ancient Maya and ancient Aztec imagery that I had taken very early on in my undergraduate experience. And so that's what really kind of led me to the Maya. And so when I went to UT, I was really going with very little awareness of the ancient Maya. And I was just kind of jumping in with both feet. And then I really got hooked because my then master's thesis advisor, Nikolai Gruba, gave me two different topics to think about for my master's thesis, and I ended up focusing on pabellon molded carved ceramics. And in order to work on those, I went to Guatemala and took pictures of archaeological examples of the ceramics that were all stored in the Ceramicoteca in Guatemala City. And that was just kind of one of those like moments for me where I was sitting there taking photographs of all of these sherds of Maya ceramics. And I just had one of those moments where I'm holding the sherd in my hand, about to lay it underneath my camera. And I think to myself, you know, aside from the archaeologist, I'm the first person who's touched this since the ancient individuals laid it in the ground. And that just kind of was like, you know, a mind-blowing moment for me, even though it sounds fairly obvious now. And that really hooked me. And from then on, I had no questions about what I was doing and why I was doing it.
See, I noticed you have quite a bit, let's say it's a lengthy resume. Of course, I got interested and I saw that you're skilled in art history, curating, and student development, which were a tattoo education, but obviously we're interested in all sorts of historical stuff that relates to art. So how does that work at your university and teaching others and having others involved in what you're studying? And I guess the roles would have switched since gaining your master's.
Yeah, so basically, when I started teaching, and really how the relationship with the students work depends a little bit on what level of institution you're at. And so I had been at Eastern Connecticut State University recently, 5 years ago. I left there. And that was a 4-year institution where I had a lot of resources to develop my own research and to involve students in it. And so there was a kind of closer relationship between my research and the classes that I was offering, because I was able to offer more discipline-specific classes and area-specific classes. I now moved to California to take a job at Ventura College, and I've been here for 5 years, and it's a wonderful place, a wonderful college, but it is a community college, which means that it's a 2-year college. The difference there is that while I still do get to teach my Mesoamerican specialty, I don't get to develop as many classes that focus only on the Maya. And so I do still manage to insert my research and currently what I'm working on into our discussions, but it's briefer, I would say, in the current setting. And I really kind of disseminate that information in talks at conferences and things like that. And then I'll give my students kind of synopses of that information. At different times, I have asked students to work with me on data entry material that's working towards a much larger kind of ceramic database that I'm in the process of compiling, that has basically, when you're thinking about Maya ceramic studies, we have all of these people working at all of these different sites throughout the Maya world, but there's no cohesive database of the entire data set. And so that's one of the things that is kind of a lifelong project that I'm working on, that I've involved students with over the years periodically. And then beyond that, I'm really interested in encouraging this my students to work through the images in the same way that I have over time. And so I assign papers and things like that ask them to think about symbolism. But what I also find is that, something is most interesting to you if you make it yours in a way. And most of my students are not going to be art history majors, fairly obviously. Instead, they're going to be usually, I get, of course, it is they are GE courses that I teach. So I get students from all over the spectrum in terms of what majors they are focusing on. But a good portion of my students are art majors. And so in many cases, I try to couple the field of study and the close kind of symbolic understanding of the iconography that we're looking at, also with artistic development. And so I ask my students to develop their own images using ancient symbolism. And then, of course, they're getting graded on how well they understood that symbolism and incorporated it in their own images.
Excellent. So jumping in, switching roles a little bit, what are we going to be talking about today? And how are these some of the things that you typically start with in one of your courses, say at the beginning of the year, or is it something that you feel passionate about in your, one of the many things?
So today I thought that we would talk about the different ways in which the Maya treated their body. I know, of course, that with this group, we're particularly interested in tattooing. And for the Maya, for the ancient Maya, I should say, we simply don't know if they practiced tattooing at a large scale. We have a number of pieces of evidence that suggest that either tattooing or scarification or some other kind of visual body modification of that type was used, but there's a lot of discussion about how exactly to interpret the images, because that's what we're left with at this point. They didn't talk about in the text that they left us the way in which they modify their bodies or their display themselves. And they in terms of the text, they focus much more on time statements and on lineage statements and the accomplishments of different kings and lords and things like that. So they don't really talk about appearance at all, or very, very briefly. And they certainly don't talk about things like tattooing or the kinds of ear spools that they like or things like that, for instance. So we really have to look at the imagery for that information. And of course, that means then that there's a lot of interpretation involved in how to understand the images that we're looking at. So I thought that given the audience that I was going to be facing today, that we would just go through some of that information and look at the evidence that we have for different kinds of body modification, different kinds of body presentation, as it relates briefly to tattooing, so I can just kind of show you the questions that we have in the field and what kind of evidence we see that suggests that we might have some tattooing or possibly scarification or some other kind of body treatment. And then I thought I would just go through the different kinds of ways in which the Maya approach the display of the self. And that is presented in both permanent and impermanent ways that permanently modify the body's shape and appearance, and then also in much less permanent ways too. So I thought I would just kind of run through some of those things. And of course, if anybody has any questions, I'm always happy to stop and look at more images in more detail, or of course, we can always focus on symbolism and things like that too.
Sure. And the last thing before we do jump in, I'm curious, without something that kind of properly documents everything going on, which could be a disarray, how time sensitive really is this, what you're doing? Because, a couple generations apart and this information could be lost totally, Well,
yeah, that is a core issue. And one of the things that's been happening with the Maya more generally and ancient Maya studies more generally is the decipherment of the ancient text. There are many different groups. I was kind of tangentially associated with one for a while called MAM, M-A-M, standing for Maya for Ancient Mayan, or Los Antiguos Mayas por Maya. What that group is trying to do is trying to connect the scholars here in the United States and in other places in Europe who are epigraphers, and they are trying to connect them to indigenous communities where there's very strongly the desire to redevelop and get in touch with this ancient knowledge, which of course in many cases was actively oppressed and destroyed during the events of the conquest and the conversion that followed right after it. The audience may have heard about, for example, the Hato Muertos de Fe, which are these big book burning episodes that different clergy were involved with as they were trying to control the Yucatan Peninsula. The most famous one happened at a place called Maline. And in one of these kind of horrible examples of understatement, we see the friar kind of describing what he sees as he's burning all of these indigenous books. And he says, oh, well, the natives were somewhat saddened and upset by this. Well, of course they were, because, of course, the entire knowledge base that they had been developed over generations upon generations was being destroyed in just one big single act. We still do have 4 Maya codices that managed to escape that destruction, and we have a lot more Central Mexican codices, which is very fortunate to us. The Spanish understood the Central Mexican approach to writing differently than the way they understood the Maya approach. They thought that the Aztecs and other groups like them, when they wrote things down in books, they thought that they really could separate out religion from politics and economics and things like that. So they tried to save the books that they saw as being more economic or political in nature, and then they would just kind of selectively destroy the ones that they saw as being more religious. They also really actively used what are called indigenous informants to write their own books explaining the history of the area as a way of helping them then control it. The clergy in the and the missionaries, etc., in the Yucatan had a different approach, and they didn't think that they could see a difference between what was political and what was religious. And of course, for all of the Mesoamerican groups in the ancient period, there really is a kind of core overlap between politics and religion and economics, where they all are very synergistic and feed off of each other. So in any case, because the Spanish couldn't see a difference between politics and religion for the Maya, that's why they really focused on destroying everything that they could get their hands on. Whereas for the Central Mexicans, some of that destruction was halted a little bit, at least, because of this sense that they could see something different. And it means, as a result, that we have a lot more left from that kind of just pre-conquest period in Central Mexico than we do for the Maya world, unfortunately.
Very unfortunately.
Yes, yes. And it also means that as we've seen happen in many other indigenous communities, we just, of course, heard about that tragic mass burial that was found up in Canada. There is this active desire by the conquering population to oppress the indigenous ways and to replace them with the kind of Spanish ways in this particular case. And in that case, they were fairly savvy in the way that they used already existing structures, both in terms of ways of thinking about the relationship with the divine, but also in thinking about just economic structures and political structures. So in that sense, that's part of why we can still see some of these loans continuing on from the ancient period into the modern period, even as other things like the ancient writing got lost, even though the ancient language continued on and has kind of morphed into the present moment. So that's one of the things that groups like MOM, for example, is trying very hard to do, and has been trying hard for a long time, and has really developed a lot of movement around, is involving the indigenous communities with the decipherment of hieroglyphic script, which is now about, I would say, 90% deciphered, 95 maybe % deciphered at this point.
Awesome. Very interesting. So would you like to go ahead and start with the PowerPoint? I could talk to you for, I would say, hours or days or weeks about all the different things, but let's jump into your presentation, and I will keep my eye on questions and let you know.
That sounds great. Okay, so I just thought I would go through a couple of things. Of course, we don't really need to look at the title too much anymore. But I just thought I would throw up a couple of my most recent publications, just by way of kind of solidifying the fact that I am an expert in this field, and that I really focus on the ancient Maya, and more specifically on ideas of architectural space, but also religious space, economic space, social space, and also ceramics more specifically too. Now, I mentioned earlier that we really have a lot of questions when it comes to ancient Maya body treatment and how to understand it, because once again, we don't have the textual information that would tell us how to understand it. And so we have to read the images that we're looking at in the way that an ancient Maya individual would read them. And that in and of itself is a little bit of a trick, because of course we don't have any ancient individual Maya standing over our shoulder telling us what to do. Now that means that there's a lot of stuff that is very obvious to us. The Maya use a very representational system, as I'm sure many of you know, and so that means that when we're looking at a human figure, we recognize it as a human figure. But there, of course, also is all sorts of symbolism that's packed into Maya imagery, and the Maya and other Mesoamerican cultures are really known for packing their images full of symbolic information. And so that's really our question now, is how do we read this more symbolic information that we're seeing in these images? And there have been lots of different ideas about how to read them. So first I'm just going to mention the different interpretations, and then I'll walk you through a couple of the images and just show you some of these details. So of course, tattooing is one of the most obvious interpretations when you see any kind of mark on the body. However, when we look at enough of these examples of marks on the body, they tend to focus on the face, especially on the cheek. We also see them coming from in front of the ear too, so kind of the back side of the cheek, and as opposed to the front side of the cheek right by the mouth. And then we also commonly see them on upper arms or on upper legs, somewhere around, like, say, the quad area, but seen from the side, actually. So when we look at how the Maya are doing things, they really tend to be localizing the kind of additional treatments of the body in those locations. And as a result, it may be tattooing, but it may also be a form of scarification. When we see it in 3 dimensions in sculpture, as I'll show you in just a moment, there is a 3-dimensional quality to the applique quite often. In the case of clay objects, for example, it's quite often an applique, as I was just saying, something that has been literally stuck on the top of the figurine in this additive process. It may also be a representation of other kinds of body modification that are less permanent in nature. It doesn't have to be a permanent form of tattooing. It may instead be drawn on, for example, and we have some evidence of that practice as well, as I'll show you in just a little bit. Although we don't know when they're painting things on the body, we don't know if they're being very precise or if they're doing these color washes, which we do see very clearly in the imagery. Of course, we expect that a lot of this information is coded with symbolism too. So then our question is, what symbolism is carried here? And in order to be able to identify that symbolism, we have to see lots of different examples in lots of different contexts. And when we're talking about this particular kind of visual, there are fewer examples rather than more examples. So that's another issue that we face in our interpretation, is that we simply don't have a ton of these kinds of examples. And then finally, in addition to all of these possibilities, it may be representing evidence of blood. And more specifically, evidence of past auto-sacrifice. Auto-sacrifice just means that somebody is letting their own blood. And for the Maya and for all other Mesoamerican cultures, the letting of someone's blood was a very important ritual activity. So people talk a lot about human sacrifice in Mesoamerica, and yes, there certainly was human sacrifice that was practiced. So too, by the way, was there in Europe as well, amongst, say, the Romans, for example, the Greeks, etc. So the Maya, the Aztecs are certainly not alone in that practice. And when they're doing it, they are very specifically thinking about it as a religious prerogative, something that has to happen in order for things to go on, in order for the world to continue, and so on and so forth. So it becomes not just a religious prerogative, but a moral prerogative. Now, when we talk about the Maya, of course, they could sacrifice a human, and we do see examples of them having done that. For example, if they go out to war, they catch somebody during that war event and then haul them back home, and then several days later, a week, a month, whatever it is, they then sacrifice them. In one case, for example, we know that they took the king from one site and then held on to him for a while before sacrificing him, because when you have a living king, you can't replace him. So as a result, it then allowed that one side to control that other side whose king they had. Now, even though we do see that evidence of human sacrifice, what we see much more evidence of, at least for the Maya, is this auto-sacrifice. So instead of killing somebody else and using all of their blood in the kind of offering to the gods, which is what that is, you could instead let your own blood in much smaller amounts. Now, there's a lot of discussion about exactly how much blood would let. People argue that we might be looking at enough blood loss that would introduce trance states. That's certainly possible, but that's one of those things that we simply can't say at this point one way or another, because we don't have any concrete evidence that allows us to say one way or the other. What we can say, though, is that there is very distinct evidence of many different bloodletting rituals. And for the Maya, they also understood blood as having a hierarchy. So the blood of the commoners was literally less valuable as a sacrifice or as an offering to the gods than the blood of the king. So it is also the king's prerogative and the king's duty then to let blood in order to keep the world happy, in order to keep the gods satisfied, and to make sure that the fortunes of the site continue on. Now, it's that auto-sacrifice then that may be leaving some of these traces that we're seeing, these this kind of residue of blood in these different locations. And in that case, we in art history would call that a signifier. So the residue of the blood would then signify the entire past ritual event, and would therefore both assure viewers that the site was being taken care of, that the gods were being appeased, that they were receiving these sacrifices. It would also legitimize the king's position, because it is showing that he is doing this for all the rest of us and making sure that things continue on our behalf. So in that case, of course, then the display either of the act of bloodletting or of the after effect, the blood itself, would be a very kind of charged political thing for royalty in the Maya world. And so that's another kind of complicating component to how we read this visual imagery that we're going to be looking at. Okay, so those are some of the different interpretations, and then I thought I would walk through some of the images that we're seeing. So I'm going to focus really on the Maya world, but I will step just outside of the Maya world briefly to talk about other cultures surrounding the Maya, and then later on we'll get a little bit more into the Mexica or the Aztecs as we look at some non-Maya imagery too. Now, just to clarify things really quickly in case some of the audience isn't aware, when we're talking about Mesoamerica, we're talking about the cultural zone that covers all of what is now known as modern-day Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize, and then just parts of Honduras and El Salvador. So that's Mesoamerica. We call it Mesoamerica in the ancient period because there is even though we have a whole lot of different cultures, the Maya, the Aztecs, the Olmec, and so on and so forth, we still have this kind of general umbrella level shared cultural approach to things. So for example, everybody tends to believe that there is a divine king that should lead the local population in one way or another. Most major sites have ball courts, those kinds of things, all help define this larger region for us. Now, interestingly enough, politics is one of the things that's very different. When we look at the Mexica later on, just before the conquest, we're dealing with political centralization, where we're talking about an empire. When we're looking at the Maya earlier on, we're dealing with more of a kind of city-state type of political organization, so much more segmented, no universal control over the entire Maya region. Which, just as an aside, of course, means that when the Spanish come over to conquer Mesoamerica, they conquer the Aztecs, and that happens relatively quickly because once they conquer the king in Tenochtitlan, they conquer the whole Aztec area. When they talk about the Maya, however, it took them a lot longer to conquer that area because you conquer one king at one site, it doesn't mean anything for all of the other sites, right? You have to conquer each one. And so that's a very different governmental system. Anyway, what I'm showing you here on the map is the Maya area of Mesoamerica. So that's Guatemala, the Yucatan Peninsula, Belize, and then just little bits of Honduras and El Salvador too. Now, what I'm also showing you here, of course, is Yaxchilan Lintel 24. And Yaxchilan, just for those of you who care about such things, is right over here on the map, just on the kind of edge of Guatemala and Mexico on the Usumacinta River. And here you're seeing one of the lintels. So a lintel is just the top of the door frame. So you have to walk into the doorway, look up, and then that's what you would see. And here we're seeing one of these examples of auto-sacrifice. If you look really carefully, you can see that the female figure, just to walk you through it really quickly, this figure on the left is the male. This figure here on the right is the female. You can tell that because she's wearing this beautiful, finely worked and embroidered robe and dress, whereas the guy's just got a loincloth on. And you can probably just barely see that she's got this rope that she's holding that's going up like so and then through her hands. And also, if you look really carefully, you can see that there are these little hooks that are coming off the rope. Well, those are thorns. And if you look very carefully around her mouth area, what she's doing is she's pulling that rope through her tongue, and the thorns are cutting her tongue, and that's letting blood in this auto-sacrifice ceremony that's designed to help her husband, the king, who's standing right next to her. Now, when we look more closely at her mouth, and I'm just going to provide a drawing here so you can really see the detail. I wish we could all go to the British Museum, which is where this particular object is held, and really stare at it in detail. But lacking that, I'll just show you a drawing of this area. So this stuff that you're seeing through here, all of this is her ear spool or a big fancy earring. And it comes out like this. But all of that stuff that you're seeing there and there, that is additional information that has nothing to do with the ear flare, and it's coming from her mouth, and it's showing up right here on her cheek. So this is exactly the kind of thing that people have looked at, and they've said, oh, maybe that's tattooing, because we're seeing this line work showing up on the side of the face. In this case, however, it seems really clearly to be this evidence of blood showing up after or during the pulling of the rope of thorns through the tongue, and then acting as this signifier for the larger ritual that is taking place here. Now, as a result of that, we have a couple of other images then that we don't know how to read. So in this particular case, you can see this is a royal Maya woman. She's got very nice clothing on. They've painted her with this, what's called a Maya blue, a very vibrant blue that we see here. She's got a beautiful visage, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But more specifically, what we're seeing here around her face are all of these little dots around her lips and onto her cheeks, etc. Now, that's what I was talking about also when I talked about applique and being able to see that there's actually a three-dimensional quality. A three-dimensional quality to the features on the face itself. So that would suggest maybe scarification or something along those lines. But it may also be this desire to show the referencing to the blood that's being let or has been let previously. So this is where that kind of ambiguity in understanding the imagery comes in. Do we see this as an example of scarification? Should we instead read it as something being like what we saw at Yaxchilan, even though we don't see the actual bloodletting ceremony occurring at this particular moment? So that's why we have so many questions about the imagery that we're looking at when it comes to whether or not we're seeing scarification or tattooing in the images that we're seeing here. Just to show you one more example that provides yet another case of this confusion, this is a captive monument. And you can tell, by the way, just in case you're interested, that you're looking at a captive here in the Maya world because he has very little clothing on and especially very little regalia. So just a very simple necklace around his neck. And in fact, you see how it kind of mirrors the rope cord that's over his arm as well. Very few indications of markers on the headdress, and then a very simple ear treatment as well. Probably in this case paper that's been pulled through the ear loops, which is significant when we think about Maya imagery, but I don't want to get too off topic, so maybe we'll come back to that particular topic in just a little bit. In any case, though, this is a lord, but he's not wearing all of the normal kind of big, fancy, lordly regalia. So that shows us that he's been humiliated by having his clothing removed. He's also in this reclining position, which is really unusual for Maya lords. It's a position of weakness or transition. And so as a result, it's often used to show these prisoner figures. Now, if you know your Maya imagery, you might think, oh, well, ball players also show up in that reclining position as they're diving under the ball to hit it up onto the slants of the slanted ball court. And of course, you'd be exactly right. But that is another one of these kind of moments of transition that's associated with transformance in some ways, or connection with supernatural spaces. And if we have time and you guys would like to get into that, I'm happy to do that later. But moving on, in relation to this image then, we clearly have a prisoner based on all of this information. Another piece of evidence that supports that is that this is a monument at Toni Na, as you can see here, another Maya site not too terribly far from the Yaxchilan area that we were looking at before. And even though the monument is from Toni Na, it's showing a Naranjo king, so a king from another site. And we know that in part because he's named on this monument. When you look at the text, you can see that not only do we have a text showing up here in this larger set of glyphs, it's mostly numeric. It's talking about the day in which something happened. In this case, the day in which a warfare event happened. So the date is right here, and then the warfare event is mentioned right here. And then you're seeing a second line of text carved directly onto the person's upper leg, as you're seeing here. And that provides more specifics about the individual. We see a number of these kinds of examples, and usually it's providing the person's name. This happens both in the Maya world. It also happens at places like Monte Alban and other locations as well. So it's a very common practice. Well, I don't know if I would say very common, but it is a common practice in Mesoamerica in the ancient period. And this is another one of these cases where people are saying, scholars more specifically are saying, is that an example of tattooing? Is that an example of scarification? Did they, when they managed to capture prisoners like this in warfare events, did they literally carve their names on their legs or tattoo them on their legs? Or is this just a visual representation? So they label him in the image, but if you were actually there and were looking at him in person, you would never see it on his body. So that's another one of these questions of interpretation. How are we supposed to understand and read and see that particular component of the drawing? We know, of course, generally speaking, what it says, but once again, when we talk about these nuances to interpretation, how exactly are we to understand it? Is it just a visual marker to clarify who this is, or is it more associated with something that is actually represented on the person himself in the real world? Okay. Any questions about any of that so far? I guess I should ask.
No questions so far. I've heard from people that you've already answered their questions.
Well, if I talk long enough, I'll get there sometime.
That's the goal, right?
Right. Okay, so now that we've kind of dealt with it, not quite answered, but dealt with this question about whether we see tattooing in the Maya world, I thought we would go into more types of body presentation. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about both permanent types of body presentation and also less permanent types of body presentation. So one of the most permanent and the earliest types of body presentation that has to be introduced in the Maya world especially is what we call cranial modification. So, of course, we see this in other indigenous populations too, in native North America. It's less common in other areas of Mesoamerica, but it definitely does happen. The Maya don't have the corner on this market, so to speak. But in order to develop that kind of cranial modification that you're seeing there in the image, where the brow line, so in a kind of developmentally average skull, you would have the bridge of the nose come up and then the front of the skull come up from there, right? In the case of the Maya, the bridge of the nose comes up and then the head is wrapped when the child is very young and the head is still malleable, the skull is still malleable, and they will wrap it so that that line of the nose just keeps going straight back, so that you don't have this big kind of bump up for the forehead area that we see in people without cranial modification. Now, of course, if you don't know anything about cranial modification or the way that the skull or the brain works in these early periods, then you might think, oh my gosh, what are they doing to themselves? Are they hurting their brains? Are they reducing cognitive ability? And the answer to all of that is no. not at all. Because they're doing it when the individual is an infant, the brain and the skull are both very, very malleable. And so they just get wrapped for these long periods. The skull moves into these more elongated shapes, and the brain moves to that shape as well, with no damage to the brain, no damage to cognitive ability or anything like that. It's purely an aesthetic change in the way that the head looks. And as a result of that, it becomes a marker of Maya-ness in the ancient period. And this is something that's recognized both by Maya and non-Maya populations as this kind of permanent marker of Maya-ness, and also oftentimes of Maya eliteness more specifically. Okay, so that's a permanent form of modification. And then we also see, along with that, a very impermanent form of treatment to the body that affects presentation and is particularly popular in ritual events. So it may be hard for you to make out all of the details of what you're seeing here. So once again, I'll just walk you through it a little bit. This, by the way, is a rollout vase. It's a polychrome rollout vase. Polychrome just means many different colors. And the vase is referring to the fact that you're looking at a ceramic vessel here. And in this particular case, it would be a tall cylinder vessel, not unlike, for example, this water, glass of water that I'm using here. Although, of course, instead of being glass, it would be made out of ceramic. And then the imagery wraps around the outside of that. So in reality, if you were looking at this ceramic, you'd have to turn it in order to be able to see all of the different components that we're looking at here. There is a photographer in the Maya world, however, that's developed this kind of rollout technique where he takes a prolonged exposure picture as he puts the vessel on a turntable. And that means that we get to see all sides of the vessel all at once. His name is Justin Kerr, by the way. If you're interested in checking out other Maya vases, I would definitely recommend going to his mayavase.com website, www.mayavase.com. I think I have it mentioned in another one of these slides here that'll be coming up. And you've got just oodles of vessels that you can search from on that site. And as a matter of fact, Justin Kerr kind of revolutionized our ability to study Maya vessels by making all of these public. Now, what we're seeing here is the kind of final preparations for some big ceremonial event. We've got a female figure, starting out the scene here on the left, and she's got this beautiful kind of star-marked huipil, or again, one of those kind of shapeless dresses that the Maya so favored in the ancient period and continue to favor today in traditional communities. Next to her, we see an even higher class female figure. We know she's higher class because she's got this kind of fancier dress that includes this thing that sticks out from behind, this back rack that we would call it. And she's also identified as an artist here because if you zoom in, you can see that she's got paint quills coming out of her headdress, which is a common mark of the artist in the Maya world. Now, right next to her, we can see the Lord, who is the subject of the scene. And if you think he's standing in a slightly odd position, you'd be right. The Maya usually orient the body in one direction, and they don't have the body going in one way and then turn the face back the other way. That's very unusual. And the reason for that in this particular case is that he wants to turn around to make sure that this guy is doing his job right. And what that guy is doing, as you can see right here, is he's painting the rear end of this Lord. We see a number of different kinds of examples of this, not always focused on the rear end, I might add, where we see the painting of the body as being important relative to ceremony. When we look at body color in Maya imagery, we also see that particular kinds of body color are really important at signifying or suggesting ritual activity as well. A kind of darker red, and that's the color that you can see being used right here, sometimes can indicate that to us, but of course, sometimes it's also hard to figure out if you're looking at a darker red or an intentional presentation of skin color without painting. We also see the incorporation of black, a very dark, heavy black that is placed on the body as a representation of the painting of the body associated with priestly activity and the ability to access other spaces, supernatural spaces. Okay, and then finally, this last figure over here is holding. As you can see, he's just kind of standing there going like this. And the thing that he's holding right here is a mirror. So the Lord is watching what this guy is doing, but he's doing it by looking in the mirror that's reflecting what's going on behind him. So that's a perfect example then of this less permanent form of body modification that we think happened all the time, and that we suspect was quite common, even though we have these kind of reduced examples of it here. Again, unfortunately for us, it's exactly the kind of thing that gets lost the second that it's washed away. These kinds of treatments, just like the tattoos or the scarification or things like that that would have happened, while those are certainly more permanent, in the Maya world, when we're talking about ancient remains, they simply don't stand the test of time, because for the Maya world, we're dealing with, for large parts of that space, a cloud jungle, which means more specifically that we don't get the kinds of mummies that we get in Peru. Mummies in Mesoamerica are very, very few and far between. And so as a result, we simply don't have that kind of hard evidence that we can look to and say, oh, well, obviously we're looking at a tattoo there or scarification or whatever it is. Now, we also see, when we think about other forms of kind of body display and body modification, the elongation of the earlobes in order to accommodate what are called, in the ancient period, ear flares or ear spools. And I just thought I would show you one example of a pair of ear flares that have been found in a burial, which is why they're in such good condition and why they made their way into a museum instead of being sold on the black market, basically. They're jade. Jade was extremely significant at a symbolic level for Mesoamerican communities. It was associated with prestige because jade is a hard object to get and hard to carve. It's also associated with trade networks because it doesn't show up all over the place in Mesoamerica. You have to get it from a very specific location. So if you can do that, then you have access to and control over trade routes. And then on top of that, it's also, because of its color, very significant. The Maya didn't, and Mesoamericans didn't, in the ancient period, differentiate between blue and green. So something that is green or sometimes blue, as jade is then able to tap into ideas associated with green growing things, fertility, but also blue things like rain, connected too with very important ideas of fertility and things like that. So jade then is a very kind of luxury object, a very elite object that displays the access to resources and the legitimacy of the person who then gets to wear it. And of course, in this case, and in most cases when you're dealing with ear spools in the Maya area and in other places in Mesoamerica, you're often seeing representations of flowers. And in that case, the beauty of the flower is being likened to the beauty of the person who wears the flower. I just thought I would take this opportunity to show you a couple of other examples of ear spools and ear flares outside the Maya area, since we've been talking about the Maya so much so far. This is coming from the Olmec heartland. So if we look at that map of Mesoamerica once again, the Olmec heartland is in this yellow kind of area, just to the west of, oh, that's delightful. Sorry. There we go. Yes, thank you. I know how to do this. I apologize for this for some reason.
I have been there. I was having a lot of tech difficulties today myself.
Of course, it's going to tell me how to do all of this, which I already do know how to do, believe it or not. Okay, here we are back again on our Olmec face, and here is the Olmec heartland right here on the map of Mesoamerica. This guy comes from San Lorenzo, which is just right around in there. Now, he's a monumental head, so if I was to stand right next to him, he would be taller than I am. These heads are massive. And there's a lot to say about them that we don't have time to discuss, and also doesn't relate to body modification. However, I am just showing you to point out that you can see the ear lobe here, and then you can also see that there's something sticking out of it right here, with one little line through it. What that is it's possible because of the lengthened earlobe, because this guy's been wearing these nice big heavy jade ear spools. But what is actually there in this particular case is a folded strip of paper that's been pulled through the earlobe. And in case you needed more evidence that auto-sacrifice was important for Mesoamericans, that's what that paper is doing. The Mesoamerican cultures would catch the blood on paper and then they would burn it, and that's how they would provide the offering to the gods. So wearing a strip of paper through your ear then was a marker of your piousness, your kind of paying it to the gods more directly. So even though it seems like a very simple, humble thing, and is a very simple, humble thing for this guy to be wearing in his ear, he's using it to show how much he cares for his community and what hard work he is doing for his community. When we look at others of these heads, we can see all different kinds of ear spools showing up. Not everybody wants to talk about auto-sacrifice and the paper ear spool. So here you're seeing just a circular ear spool, a regular circular ear spool with a dangler showing up. Here you've got a much bigger kind of plug showing up to stretch the earlobe. So you've got lots of different options when you're thinking about ear treatments in Mesoamerica. We also see all kinds of focus on the teeth too. So these are just two Maya examples of dental modification. And you can see that they both shave the teeth to create specific shapes. And they also carved into the teeth in order to introduce inlays. And the interesting thing about this, as you can tell from the images that you're looking at, is that they managed to do all of this without actually, in almost all cases, damaging the root of the tooth, because the tooth doesn't decay after they've done what they're going to do here. Now, again, they're doing this because of the strong symbolism that's associated with the shapes that they are introducing and the inlays that they're introducing. So if you looked at those inlays and said to yourself, huh, that looks green and I wonder if that's jade, yeah, you're on the right track. That is jade, or possibly serpentine, another green stone that was very popular in the Maya area. And again, it's to really kind of try to tap into this idea of access to resources, natural resources, and fertility more specifically. Now, you're also seeing here that the shape of the tooth is important too, and sometimes the shape that the tooth makes in conjunction with other teeth. So this kind of T shape that you're seeing right here is very common for the Maya especially. You're seeing even more elaborate kind of forms like right here. And when you look at Maya hieroglyphs, the hieroglyph that contains that sign is ik, which means wind. So it's this kind of beautiful metaphor of marking the front of the mouth with the idea of wind, and of course what comes out of your mouth, well, breath. Right, so there's a nice kind of visual parallel there between the elite presentation of the grill and then, of course, also the concept behind it as well. Okay, any questions so far?
Oh, we did have a question earlier about the cranial modification, and if that's specific to those parts of the world, or if, is that something that has been found in other parts of the world?
We definitely do find it in other parts of the world. I'm not as familiar with where we find it elsewhere, so I would be hard-pressed to give you a specific location, but I know that it's been found in different places in Europe, and I think also in Asia too. But like I said, I don't have those references easy to mind at the moment. Okay,
all right, awesome. And then the other question that we had was about the potential for some of the artifacts or writings to have been hidden before the fires and the stuff like that in the Spanish conquest.
Yes, and that did happen. So there is the possibility that we are going to come onto this treasure trove of new material. And indeed, when you think about excavating a Maya site, that's kind of like a treasure trove just in and of itself automatically. And just to kind of back up for a second in relation to that, when you think about places like the Yucatan Peninsula, if you go to the Yucatan Peninsula now and you kind of drive around, you may not be as aware of what you're seeing unless you go to, say, Uxmal or Chichen Itza or Tzipilchaltun, or one of these kind of consolidated sites that's been excavated and then presented for tourist presentation. But if you drive through the Yucatan and you see these mounds in the landscape, then you might be looking at hills. Odds are, though, you're looking at pyramids that have kind of crumbled over time and have been grown over with vegetation and trees and things like that. My point here just being that it's almost true to say that the Yucatan Peninsula is like Swiss cheese in the sense that if you throw a stone, you are almost likely to hit a Maya pyramid. It's, in other words, a very densely packed space covered with ancient Maya sites. And you guys may have heard about the whole kind of LIDAR business that revolutionized our understanding of Maya settlement patterns. We knew there were lots of Maya sites out there. That's not what it revolutionized. It revolutionized how far those Maya sites spread into the landscape and how densely packed they were outside of what we had considered the nucleated zone of each of those sites. So that really kind of just further solidifies this idea that the whole Yucatan Peninsula in the ancient period was just covered with civilization and the evidence of civilization. I'm forgetting now what the question was.
We were asking about the potential of finding those artifacts. I'm sure, I mean, if that were to happen in this day and age, I know for a fact that, you know, well, let's just say back to the Great Depression, people have that, you know, motivation to hide things.
Yes, that's exactly
right. Taken.
Especially when you get these examples of the Spanish coming through. When we think about the conquest, for example, the Maya watched the conquest happen to the Aztecs. So they knew when the Spanish started looking their way and started coming into the Maya world, they had a sense of what to expect. And so it would not be surprising at all that they did hide stuff away. And we actually see some examples of that discussed in the Aztec world, where one manuscript in particular was hid away and then was brought out later when the indigenous individuals found that such ancient manuscripts could be used in trials as evidence for land ownership, amongst other things. Now, in the Maya world, we do have an example of a codex that was recently found, recently in the 80s, I believe. And there is some question about whether it is authentic Maya. Now, I think it is, a lot of people think it is, but I'll just kind of have said that there is some question about whether it is an authentic Maya document. However, it was found in a box in a cave. So that suggests that it is exactly what you're talking about, this effort to kind of squirrel away important ancestral information and to protect it when, of course, we're about to see this massive destruction and series of destructive events sweep through the Yucatan. So yeah, hopefully we will find yet more examples of that, or indigenous communities that have secreted these spaces away will remember them and be able to find them or want to bring them to light in the future. We are hampered in some ways, though, in the Maya area because, once again, we are dealing with this cloud forest. So things like wood and paper don't last very long unless they are very carefully kept. So that's the one concern. There are some exceptions to that general rule, but that is the one concern about if such materials were left behind, would we even still have access to them, even in that scenario?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a very good point there.
Okay, so I thought that I would just also show you guys really quickly one example of postmortem modification as well. So of course this happens after the body, after the soul is gone, after any kind of living component of the person is gone. And in this case, we see a couple of different ways of treating the body. Certain ancestors, the Maya are very clearly practitioners of ancestral veneration, and we see lots and lots of different data points that provide us with evidence for this. One of the most obvious is that they often would go into tombs of previous kings, open them back up, and then paint the bodies, of course what's left at that point of the bodies, which are the bones, red with cinnabar. Again, kind of thinking about probably symbolism associated with life, blood, and things of that nature. And more specifically, the kind of bloodline of the ancestors and the dynasties at that particular site. So that's a way in which the body can be reverentially treated later on in this kind of more intimate way. Now, people who are captives don't, experience that kind of reverential treatment. Instead, we have bones that are human bones in the Maya world that have been carved into various things. And in some cases, we have pretty strong evidence that we're looking at the bone of a captive, usually a leg bone, because of course, leg bone provides you with a lot of space to carve. In some cases, we know this because the bone actually says, this is the bone of so-and-so. In other cases, when the Maya talk about taking captives, they talk about the way in which they refer to captives most commonly in the ancient text is as bones. He took 20 bones. He is the captor of 20 captives, in other words. So the use of bone after death can be very significant, either through these ancestral connections or as a way of continually reminding everybody involved of the kind of historic battle and then capture that took place at that point. I just thought I would show you a couple of different examples of that. So this is one of these kinds of bones that I was just mentioning. This comes from the site of Tikal. So right on the edge of Lake Petanitza, or rather not on the edge of Lake Petanitza, but very close to the Lake Petanitza, if you guys know where that is, the Lake Petén in central Guatemala, in the Petén region of Guatemala. And here you can see that it's kind of like scrimshaw. They're just lightly incising lines into the bone itself, and then rubbing the bone with, again, usually cinnabar. Sometimes it's another type of red pigment, but typically the Maya are focusing on cinnabar as the thing that they rub into these lines to make them more visible. In case that's still not terribly visible to you, I thought I would show you a drawing of the imagery on the bones themselves. In this particular case, in the case of the Tikal bones, it's mythological in nature. So you're probably looking here at the journey of the maize god through the underworld in this case. And then here you're seeing another femur that's carved at the top with a representation of the king of the site, and then talks about him more specifically. And if they're not carving bones in that way or with imagery on it, as you can see here on the right, we get lots and lots of different examples of bone tools. We don't know exactly how these tools were used. There's, again, as you might imagine, a number of different ideas. They might have been clothing pins. They might have been for weaving or embroidery. They might have been hairpins. They may have even been styluses for clay, working clay. So there are lots of different options. And the truth of the matter, of course, is that they may have been multifunctional. They may have served some of these purposes and not just been a one-use type of item. So that's the kind of postmortem modification that I was going to show you, was the treatment of these bones. Now, if you guys wanted, I know we're kind of long on time. I just went online and grabbed some images from online that provided examples of modern tattoos focused on Mesoamerican imagery. And then in many cases, the reference to the ancient image was close enough that I could pull it and present it as well. If you guys want, we can go through some of those examples, or we can open it up to Q&A or talk about other things entirely. It's up to you guys. What do you want to do?
Sure. I do have a question if you can see me. Cool. I had a question about, I guess, the debate between whether or not people were being tattooed at the time they were alive or after. And we spoke with an archaeologist, I believe it was in April. And I sent you that interview.
Yes. Yes, that was very interesting.
So like the importance of those modifications happened.
So I'm sorry, it was cutting out for about half of that, so I didn't quite catch.
I was interested in hearing your perspective on the debate between when those types of modifications occur.
For the Maya, when we see them introducing these kinds of facial treatments or body treatments, aside from the discussion of the bones that I just walked you through really briefly, it's almost always in relation to individuals who are, at least when they're shown in the image, identified as part of the here and now. So living, in other words, or manifesting at that level. There's no real evidence to suggest that they're doing it afterwards, with one caveat. So that example that we were looking at earlier with the hyena figurine, which I think you can't see now.
Sorry,
But no, it's fine. That was the woman that had the spots on her face, right? So that was from Haina Island in off the coast of the Yucatan in Mexico. And the thing about Haina Island that complicates a little bit what I was just saying is that it mostly is a necropolis, a burial location. Now, there are some other things going on there as well. We're still figuring things out. There's active archaeology that's being conducted on that island, focusing on finds like this. But what we can say categorically is that we have found, the archaeologists have found lots of examples of these kinds of figurines, these very small figurines that are very intricately done, very brightly painted in the context of those burials. So that might provide some of this evidence that some of that treatment is happening after the individual has passed on and is being buried. However, that's a pretty big kind of logical leap to make, and it seems like when they're showing things in the imagery, as far as I can think of off the top of my head, all of the examples I can think of are representing living individuals, at least in the moment in which they're being presented. And the ancestral forms that I can think of are not showing that same kind of modification of say the additional iconography on the cheeks or on the legs or things like that. So if I had to guess, then I would think that they were doing it during life and that other kinds of treatment was happening after death. We know, of course, that textiles are very important, even though we've lost a lot of them, almost all of them, in burials. We know that grave offerings are very important as well. So we would expect, I think, those kinds of things to be more emphasized rather than modifications of the body after death. But again, we don't have a lot of evidence, so to tell us either way.
Cool. And then I'm curious about some of the research and how it's, I guess, the process of trying to combine all the information from so many different sources and leaders in their own regard. Can you tell me about how that's going and what the process is like of gathering all that data into like a streamlined system?
Yeah, so that's one of the benefits that art history provides. And we could argue that archaeology is also one of these kinds of more synthetic disciplines where just in the nature of working within the discipline, you automatically have to deal with a very varied and multivariate data set. What I mean by that is if you're going to look at, let's forget Maya ceramics for a second. If I was going to look at a painting by Pablo Picasso, for instance, then if I'm going to say something meaningful about that painting, I'm probably going to want to do more than just look at what it shows us. I'm probably also going to want to look at what was going on at the time that Picasso painted it, where he painted it, what did he intend to display it with anything else around it. You know, those kinds of questions are going to require then a much larger set of information, contextual information. So I might look at history, I might look at popular imagery at the time, all of these other kinds of things in addition to just the painting itself. And the same is true, of course, for the Maya as well, where when we look at any one image, we're thinking about what was it placed with? Now, unfortunately for us, a lot of the ceramics that we know of, the really elite ceramics for the Maya world, have been looted. They've been dug up and they've been sold on the black market. So we have no idea what they were put into the ground with, which is a huge weakness on our part, because all of these things are constructed with very specific messages in mind and placed in relationship to other objects with very specific messages and functions in mind. And of course, we lose all of that when we lose the archaeological context. That being said, though, from a archaeological perspective, you need to be thinking not only about what's coming out of the ground, but you also need to be thinking about other things like, say, epigraphy. What do the glyphs say? How do we interpret them? What can they tell us about when this thing was made? What can we tell us about what it's trying to say to viewers, etc. Now, in addition to epigraphy, of course, and linguistics, we also might want to look at anthropology more generally instead of archaeology more specifically. We might want to draw from a whole kind of range of different data sets. So if I'm looking at Maya ceramics, yeah, I'm going to be interested in Maya ceramics, but I'm also going to be interested in the architecture that was being built at the time those particular ceramics were being put into buildings, for example. And where in the buildings are they being put, and so on and so forth. So I guess my overarching point is that these disciplines, like art history, are very synthetic in the sense that they allow you and they actively encourage you to draw from all of these different kinds of data points and then bring it together into this larger kind of synthesis. Now, of course, you have to practice critical analysis in order to get there in the end. And you also always have to be looking for correctives. I see this image doing this thing in this way at this location. What about this other image that looks exactly the same? Is it doing the same thing in the same way in a different location, but in a similar context? So that's what I mean by a corrective, looking for other examples. And that's really the kind of first step. For an archaeologist, the first step is uncovering the material. Right? Or that's not the first step. The first step is deciding where you're going to dig, getting the permissions, and so on and so forth. But at a conceptual level, the first step is kind of sinking the trowel into the dirt, so to speak. From an art historian's perspective, the first step would be amassing the database of the images that you're going to look at. So, if I'm looking at tattooing, for example, and I recognize that there is all this treatment on the cheek, I'm going to look at every ancient Maya image that I can possibly find in order to develop a group of the objects that show that same kind of modification, to see if I can then say anything meaningful about A, the similarities across all of those examples, but also B, the differences.
Interesting. On another note, how do you think that we can utilize the way that Mayans and others are interested in art now in comparison to before, and what similarities are there that have remained true to their culture in terms of the art?
There are lots of loans that have continued on, and I know that there are a number of indigenous practitioners who are actively trying to maintain kind of older ways of doing things, or re-identify and reinvent older ways of doing things that have been lost. So I know that in ceramics in the Yucatan, for example, there are lots of different practitioners, and in wood as well. There are many different practitioners, especially in the Yucatan. Now, of course, a lot of that gets tied into the tourist trade. So, they'll make objects in order to sell them to tourists. And in those cases, you might see some really interesting combinations of references. So instead of trying to present, say, a replica of Pakal's sarcophagus lid, they might show you Pakal from the sarcophagus lid, but then place it in conjunction with the Chichen Itza Castillo. So taking two completely different references and then kind of melding them into this idea of what represents the Yucatan Peninsula now in the kind of modern tourist mind. So oftentimes the products are being filtered through that perspective of trying to reach the market, so to speak. But we also do see fine art being made without, I'm sure that the producers want to sell their work, but without that kind of overtly tourist kind of commercialized perspective. And that also is really kind of incorporating ancient symbol sets, but then updating them as well. This is particularly the case, by the way, not necessarily in the Maya world, but in other potteries, especially in Mexico, where they were in production probably before the Spanish arrived, and then they continued being large production centers and still continue on to this day with a lot of that knowledge passed down generation to generation. So there are some, say, blackware ceramics in central Mexico that are part of that tradition. There's maybe one or two potteries in Yucatan that have gone through that same kind of process as well. We see it too in ceramics in the native North America, in the Acoma Pueblo materials too, where we see newer artists. When you look at the older ceramics, for example, from that area, it's very standard that you might get kind of some three-dimensional treatment, but a lot of it's going to be incised, and there might be some color differences in terms of surface treatment to the ceramic body. when you look now at the work that's being done, there's a lot more interest in introducing, say, turquoise into the ceramic design, etc. So there's some very interesting continuations of ancestral information, ancestral knowledge, and image patterns, but then also updating them in these really interesting ways, both in terms of imagery and in terms of media too.
Very interesting. I'm also curious if you had a bucket list of places that you could visit, or whether or not it could actually happen. What would be your top spot that you would like to explore?
Oh gosh. Well, I've been through a large part of the Maya area because of my work, but I haven't yet been to Honduras, and I'd like to go to Copan and places like that. So I guess that would be at the top of my bucket list. I also have spent a fair amount of time. Oh, sorry, I just heard something happen elsewhere. I thought I might have to run really quickly, but it's my husband's taking care of it.
Okay, not a problem.
Yeah, but so yeah, I would like to go visit Copan. I'd always like to go back to Mérida and the Yucatan Peninsula. There's always so much to see there, and so much I haven't seen, even though I've been quite a lot. And then I've also gone to central Mexico, but once again, I haven't been able to spend nearly as much time as I would like to there. And so I've only seen a few of the things that I want to see and that I think are really important throughout central Mexico. So I'd love to go back and spend more time there, and I'd love to go to places like Honduras and see the sites that they have to offer as well.
Very cool. If there's anything else that you'd like to talk to about, we're approaching about that hour mark. I would love to even hear more, another presentation in the future, for artists to really understand more about this, because there's not, I suppose, a lot of information that's readily available to regular everyday artists out there without digging and digging and digging. And of course, rabbit hole after rabbit hole.
Well, and the other problem when you're dealing with Mesoamerican symbolism and imagery is that you're dealing with an issue in scholarship, which is that early scholars didn't know what they were looking at. And so they were doing their best, but they were identifying a heck of a lot of stuff and just kind of throwing stuff at the wall to see what stuck, so to speak. And now, more recently, given that our understanding of the hieroglyphs has really just kind of, it's light years ahead of what it was 100 years ago when we first started looking at this material. We also have a much, much better understanding of the symbolism. So what I'm getting at is that if you read something from, say, the 60s or the 70s, and then you create something based on that, the work will still, of course, be completely valid. But if you're trying to go for a direct ancient reference with interpretation, then the interpretation may have changed. Because a lot of that early work has now been fine-tuned, corrected, modified, tested against the data over and over again, such that some of that early material is completely outmoded. Some of it still is exactly the way we think it is, but a lot of that early stuff is now, like I said, completely outmoded, and certain things that had a lot of currency and actually affected the way things are named. So, we have these large reclining figures popular throughout Mesoamerica, but found most famously at places like the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan, called chacmul. They're these reclining figures, and they hold bowls on their bellies, probably for the presentation of offerings. Now, that term, chacmul, actually comes from an early French explorer who came to the Yucatan, came to different locations throughout Mexico, and tried to explain what he was seeing by making up stories, basically. And he had this really fantastical fictionalized story about this character called Queen Mu, and the chacmul, which of course have nothing to do whatsoever with any of the actual ancient materials. But because he was the first one to talk about it and to publish those findings and the objects themselves, it means that they still to this day go by the name chacmul. So yeah, if you're looking for information about some of this stuff, you also have to be really careful about what you're reading and when what you're reading was written. In addition, of course, to making sure that you're trying to follow scholars who actually know what they're talking about, because that's the other thing that happens is you get a lot of people talking about this material who may think they know what they're talking about, but have not actually studied it at length in a way that allows them to get at the indigenous ancient meaning. So that also can complicate things too.
Yeah, it's worth noting too. Once everything is discovered or whatever, what the future will be like, because this quest will never end. Interpretations are always going to change. So I'm very interested. There's no way of really knowing, but it's also very important to decipher some of the stuff that needs to be weeded out that actually is fiction, and moving forward from there with facts rather than beliefs.
And that's really the beauty of this field, and one of the things that really drew me to it in the first place. If you think about this as it compares to, say, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which I still think created beautiful images, but we know all of the images that were created. We know pretty much everything about their creation too. With the Maya, we know at this moment what we think we know, but give it 10 years and we're going to have at least 20 more sites added to that spectrum, with a lot of data coming out from every site. So of course that's going to dramatically change our understanding of the details. Maybe not so much the big picture, although maybe, you never know what you're going to find. And it can really kind of have these galvanizing moments. I would also say that that I know that we don't have time to go through specific examples of modern tattoos now, but I would also be delighted to come back and, if people want to talk about particular examples that they wanted to send in, especially if they were able to do so ahead of time, I could go through and both think about what symbolism is tying into the ancient materials, but also bring in ancient examples to pair with them and talk about how those ancient examples function in the ancient period as well. I had a couple of examples in this PowerPoint, but like I said, I think we're probably too short on time to get into it. But yeah, I'm always happy to talk about that. I'm always happy to talk about Maya stuff and images more generally.
Absolutely. Well, very cool. Before we do disconnect, can you tell everyone where to find you or where to, contact you if you'd like questions, or they can send them to us and we can send them over as well.
Perfect. So I'm Maline Werness-Rude. I am at Ventura College, and you can reach me via email at Maline, M-A-L-I-N-E, Werness-Rude, W-E-R-N-E-S. Sorry, I've already getting my own email address wrong. It's M-W-E-R-N-E-S-S-R-U-D-E. So my first initial and then my entire last name, no hyphen, at VCCCD. So that's V, 3 C's, and then a D.edu.
Excellent. Well, I would love to hear from you again. Maybe we can set up some artwork in advance for you to review and share that with everybody too.
Wonderful. I'd be delighted to. Just let me know.
Cool. Well, awesome. I really enjoyed spending the day with you a little bit and learning some cool things. So I will definitely be in contact with you again. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day in California.
Likewise, it was an absolute pleasure. I love chatting about these kinds of things, and it's always fun to kind of think about new things too, simultaneously, a little bit related to, but slightly outside my wheelhouse. So that's wonderful.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you everyone for watching and tuning in, and we will be seeing you soon.